So, did matriarchy ever exist? It's a classic issue within the Marxist tradition, because, as comrades will probably know, Marx and Engels were they both did anthropology, to be honest, before anthropology was a sort of professional discipline. They were interested in this massive question, which is, what does it mean to be human? They were very well aware, both Marx and Engels, that the issue of sex was absolutely central. And perhaps it would help if I was to start. Yes, I'll start with an early text from Marx, the economic and philosophic manuscripts here. This is Marx and Engels in, I think, 1843 or something. The immediate, natural, and necessary relationship of human being to human being is the relationship of man to woman. In this natural relationship of the sexes, man's relationship to nature is immediately his relationship to man, and his relationship to man is immediately his relationship to nature, his own natural function. Thus, in this relationship is sensuously revealed and reduced to an observable fact how far for man, obviously this means humanity, in his time it was a neutral term, how far for man his essence has become nature, or nature has become man's human essence. Thus, from this relationship, the whole cultural level of man can be judged. From the character of this relationship, we can conclude how far man has become a species being, a human being, and conceives of himself as such. The relationship of man to woman is the most natural relationship of human being to human being. Thus, it shows how far the natural behavior of man has become human, or how far the human essence has become his natural essence, how far his human nature has become nature for him. This relationship also shows how far the need of man has become a human need, how far his fellow men as men have become a need, how far in his most individual existence he is at the same time a communal being. And that's just one of many passages I could have read from the early writings of Marx and of course Engels, most of which were sort of left dormant for many years. But after Marx's death, as I'm sure comrades know, Engels decided to resurrect these kind of ancient manuscripts up in an attic that had been half eaten by the mice, according to Engels, and bring them to light. And he wrote his wonderful pamphlet, The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, in which he developed these early ideas of Marx and himself in the light of what were then the latest anthropological findings. And again, as I'm sure comrades will know, in a nutshell, early human society was not based on the family, it was based on the clan, like an extended family, if you like. The clan was essentially matrilineal in descent. You acquired your membership of the clan through the female line, and residence in other words, when a young man or woman comes of age, the woman stays with her mother, with her own kin, in her own clan, and it's the young man who has to go out from his home and visit his bride and perform bride service. And this all comes from, of course, Lewis Henry Morgan's work with the Iroquois in North America, and this idea that residence was matrilocal, so women remained with their female kin as opposed to patrilocal, and that in turn produced a bias towards matrilineal in descent. So essentially, although to some extent descent might have been recognized in both lines, fundamentally the female line was primary. So, for comrades again who are interested, I'm going to just hold up this issue of the Weekly Worker from a few years ago, quite a few years ago, of course, September the 20th, 2012. Early human kinship as matrilineal, Engels was right. And as I'm speaking, I'll be making various claims. obviously without references, but actually I've just reread this piece, and nearly all the genetic and other references to up-to-date material are here. And again, if you're interested, this book here, Early Human Kinship, published by the Royal Anthropological Institute, it's got a chapter by me saying early human kinship was matrilineal. Again, there are some new references, of course. Things have happened a bit since that book was published in 2008. But essentially, the material is there. So Engels was right. It's now well known that hunter-gatherers. Let's make it a little bit more clear. There are two hunter-gatherers can be divided into two basic categories. This is James Woodburn's work. So you can have storage hunter-gatherers. You can have the kinds of hunter-gatherers who store their meat, who store wealth, and they're called storage hunter-gatherers, sometimes complex hunter-gatherers, and I prefer James Woodburn's term, delayed return hunter-gatherers. In other words, you might be fishing for salmon in the northwest coast of America or British Columbia somewhere, and you dry the salmon and you store the results. And it does look as if many going right back into the past, upper Paleolithic hunters, that's in the Ice Age in Europe, were to a large extent storage hunter-gatherers. And there are other ways of living by hunting and gathering, but still accumulating and storing produce, and those hunter-gatherers tend to be stratified. And in the northwest coast areas, they even have kind of aristocratic lineages and even slavery, actually, despite being hunters and gatherers. But these complex or delayed return hunter-gatherers clearly emerged relatively late in human evolution, in the sense that the initial hunter-gatherers would certainly have been what's called immediate return hunter-gatherers. And nearly all African hunter-gatherers, even to this day, are what we call immediate return, which simply means that there's no storage. You hunt a zebra, you hunt antelope, and you consume the meat over a few days, and storage is impossible. And where storage is impossible, you don't get accumulation. No one can sort of monopolize access to the resources, and so immediate return hunter-gatherers are egalitarian. And it's also not really disputed that in Africa, where you have immediate return hunters and gatherers, still to this day, obviously not so much, but still to this day in some parts of the world, in Tanzania, for example, with the Hadza that I've had got some familiarity with, but also the Benjeli in the Central African forest and traditionally the Kalahari hunter-gatherers. The fundamental economic institution of those people would have been bride service. So a man would have had an incentive to go hunting, not really to eat the meat, but in order to prove himself a man to his in-laws, to have a bride, to have sexual relationships. And of course, in order to keep that relationship, he had to visit his bride. This is called bride service, and surrender the meat to his in-laws. And that implied, of course, matrilocal residence, because the woman would need to be with her mother, with her relatives, in order to make sure that the man who visited her behaved, that there was no harassment, that he surrendered the meat which he obtained through hunting, and so that the economic system was really very much on favourable terms to the woman and her relatives and her kin, and that's matrilocal residence. And the scientific fact, which we've only learned quite recently, in which I based my article that I mentioned, an early human kinship as matrilineal, to a large extent, the genetics now, which is fantastic, have demonstrated that probably over thousands of years in Africa, women have lived with mum, right down the generations. And you can tell this because you can distinguish, you can just take a hair from somebody's head, analyze the DNA, you've got the mitochondrial DNA, which flows down through the female line, you've got the Y chromosome DNA, which flows through the male line. And what you find across Africa is that with hunter-gatherers, women, it's quite clear you get clusters of the same same elements of DNA are found localized, indicating that over thousands of years women have been living with mum, whereas the Y chromosome DNA is dispersed, indicating again that the men have been moving out, and in this way dispersing their genetically defined patrilineal lineages. And this just conclusively proved that matrilocal residence was the pattern for right back into the distant evolutionary past among hunter-gatherers in Africa. And that's, of course, particularly significant because Africa is the continent in which we evolved. Now, that's not quite the same thing as matrilineal descent. That's matrilocal residence. But once you've got matrilocal residence, the descent is going to be overwhelmingly biased in the direction of matrilineal. So there's a tendency towards matrilineal wherever residence is matrilocal. Now, again, of course, the title of this talk is Did Matriarchy Ever Exist? And that's another concept yet again, because of course you can theoretically imagine a system where you've got matrilocal residence and matrilineal kinship, but still, in some sense, you've got some male dominance. You've got elements of male patriarchy, or patriarchy, or even perhaps severe a degree of patriarchy. Having said that, it's actually unlikely. Where you have matrilocal residence, everything's really on the woman's side. She's living with her mum. Her brothers will be able to protect her. She's got the solidarity of the kinship, and her visiting husband, lover, if you like, not quite husband in a Western sense, because hunter-gatherers generally don't have weddings. They don't have marriage. A woman would never undertake to remain faithful to a visiting lover. So husband isn't quite the right word, but we don't really have another one. But everything's really on the side of the woman and her kin. And it's really impossible for a man to accumulate power because nothing that he produces is his own. He goes out hunting and he has to surrender his kills to his wife and her kin. His mother-in-law particularly might be in charge of things. And it's just everything he produces gets surrendered and is therefore circulated. And he doesn't have rights in that produce, but he would have rights in his sister's household with her children and the produce which comes into the household from that source. And again, everything I've just said now, apart from the genetics, of course, will be very familiar to anyone who's read Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and State, because Engels quotes in some detail how things work out in an Iroquois longhouse. Iroquois being, of course, the tribe in New York, which Morgan himself was initiated into, and he had recent historical records of house life among these Aboriginal Americans. You'd have a long house, maybe 8 or 9 hearths, each under the care of a woman, kind of a matriarch in charge of the whole household. All the stores were held in common. The women would share childcare, of course. The men coming in as husbands would never have rights in that household. They'd have rights back in their own longhouse with their own sisters. And any man who was lazy, who didn't pull his weight, who didn't bring in his share of meat, would simply be told to go. And it's rather beautifully expressed in the passages that Engels quotes. I mean, he would simply find one evening all his bow, his arrows, his moccasins, his shoes were all placed on the doorstep. A signal, right? Go home to your sister. Go home to your mum. You're not welcome here anymore. And it wouldn't matter how long he'd been in a relationship in that household. He couldn't say, "Oh, these are my kids. I'm not going to be separated from my kids," because, of course, the rule would be, well, then, no, they're not your kids. Your kids are your sister's kids. And so women could easily, even the concept of divorce doesn't even apply because they were never married in the first place. Now, I want to move on a little bit to discuss the kind of the issue of matriarchy, because although the matrilineal longhouse that Morgan describes was definitely one in which the women had the power, I mean, it is made very clear by Morgan and his sources. Whether you want to call that women's rule, it's a little bit kind of optional because, of course, men would have had a strong say, but in the longhouse, they'd have had their say not as husbands, but as brothers. And so the power was shared between men and women as brothers and sisters, despite this, a strong edge of power being in the hands of women. Now, when I'm asked the question, did matriarchy ever prevail across the planet in some time in the past? I always wanted to be a little bit more careful than simply saying yes. I wouldn't say no, but I wouldn't want to quite say yes in a simple way, because it isn't quite how things work out. And in fact, a far better way of looking at things is to think in terms of a kind of periodicity. And it's only relatively recently, although I did write about this in my book, Blood Relations, it's only relatively recently that I've had real direct feedback from comrades who've been working in Africa, particularly among the group called the Bayaka or the Benjeli in Central Africa, so-called Pygmy people, as to how things actually work. And Morna Finnegan was a student of mine at the University of East London, who then went to Edinburgh and did her further degree. And under Jerome Lewis, my close colleague, did fieldwork among the Bayaka, or the Benjeli, as the particular local group were called. And Morna developed a wonderful concept, which she describes as communism in motion. And what communism in motion means is a periodic seesaw of power moving between one gender and the other. And it's really a much more, I don't know, it just feels so much more emancipatory and inspiring than the idea of matriarchy. So just to be fairly brief to describe what happens, we have, it works through, again, Marxists don't quite have a, not most of us in the Marxist tradition are not too familiar with the concept of ritual, except when it comes to, I don't know, royal weddings and investitures and coronations and various things. But ritual can very easily be, and among hunter-gatherers is, very much rebellion. Ritual is bottom up. Ritual just sort of means collective action, kind of communism from below, singing, dancing, other forms of practical activity which just make everybody feel one force. So what happens is that you have two polarities of ritual, and among this particular group, the Benjeli, the Ajengi is the male ritual, and Ngoku is the female ritual. And I just want to stress all this because it is so clarifying as to what kind of matriarchy existed. So every now and again, the men do their ritual, and it's called Ajengi, and it's a very muscular, stomping ritual where the men show off their muscles, show off their energy and strength. Women really appreciate that. That means they're going to be good hunters. They can defend the camp, and it goes on for several days. And the point about Ajengi, this male ritual with all of its secrets, is that it has the potential to kind of outstay its welcome. There's a kind of possibility there, potentially there, that the men might take that too far and start going over a certain sort of red line, if you like, with their ritual, bottom up, celebratory action in kind of direct celebration of being masculine and being male. And what happens is that the women get a little bit bored with all this, and the men get a bit tired, and the women after a while feel, well, okay, enough is enough. And a few days later, there's a reply from the women, and that's then Ngoku. And you might be interested if you want to look at the Radical Anthropology Group website. There's some pretty good filming of this now. And Ngoku is an extraordinary outburst of raucous, bodily female power. There's nothing feminine, there's nothing genteel, there's almost nothing, I don't know, in a sort of Western sense, sort of normative about Ngoku. The women go pretty much wild, particularly the girls, and they link arms and they stomping into the center of the camp. And the men are literally quite scared. At least they sort of pretend to be scared. They take the little boys away. And what happens is the women just tease the men. Call yourselves men. They make pointed comments about their behavior as lovers, their testicles, whatever it is. And they're taunting the men as in a playful way, of course, and just saying the vagina wins and all kinds of songs and gestures, and the whole thing is actually laughter. It's raucous ridicule and laughter at men's expense, expressed by women, and this lasts again for several days until, of course, and so the women have taken power. They've established a kind of matriarchy, a period of women's rule. But of course, that can go on for too long, and the women don't have any intention of ruling for too long, because it's much more fun to give up that power, to surrender again. Women like sex as much as men like sex, and once the men have been sort of taught a lesson in a playful ritual, the women surrender themselves, and then of course, if you like, it's a period of normal, if in quotes, normal life resumes before the men start their ajengi again. And so what Mona describes is a seesaw, a periodic oscillation between the rule of men and the rule of women. And there's no incentive for the rule of women to be a permanent state. Now, what we know in historical terms is that while the rule of women was at all stages periodic and celebratory and playful and full of laughter, once that began to break down, and we think it's to do with most parts of the world, not so much in Africa, because in Africa, even to this day, you've got the megafauna, you've got the big elephants, you've got the giraffe, you've got the zebras, and hunter-gatherers lived their communism, if you like, their communism in motion. We can simply call it communism, where that word seems appropriate. It's based not just on abundance, but on superabundance. The Bejeli, for example, have no concept of scarcity or famine. They live in the forest. They have a absolutely fantastic diet of several dozen different types of honey, of very, very tasty zebra meat and other kinds of meat. I'm talking about the Hadza in Tanzania, but in the forest you get other kinds of very tasty meat and fruit and nuts and so forth. Abundance. But in most parts of the world, of course, the megafauna became extinct. In Australia, for example, the giant diprotodons and others, very large marsupials became extinct. And increasingly, with the relative scarcity of game animals and the difficulty of being assured that a periodic collective hunt would actually bring in the meat, what began to happen was that communism in motion began to collapse. And increasingly, the rule of men, which had once been a periodic rule, became more and more fixed and permanent. So what I'm saying really is, if anyone asked me the question, did matriarchy exist? I would say yes, but it was never a fixed rule by women. It was always a periodic, playful rule by women. And increasingly, in terms of the stuff that I'm writing now, with much of it in collaboration with Jerome Lewis, it's actually about laughter. And I just want to say a little bit about laughter before getting into some mythology, some actual traditional myths. Increasingly, I'm becoming aware that long before language as we know it, long before grammatically complex language, of course, language is the one thing which is absolutely a sign that we become human, if you like, anatomically and behaviorally. Language is an extraordinary development in the history of life on Earth. But it's perfectly clear to me now that a condition for the emergence of language is trust. You wouldn't get language beginning to evolve under circumstances anything like those of non-human primates, anything like those of, for example, chimpanzees. There's far too much conflict, competition, mistrust, and listeners to signals, listeners to sounds, for example, need to know from the nature of the sound that signal is reliable. And the point about words is that they could be lies. And in fact, from a chimpanzee point of view, words just are lies. Words are entirely fictions. They're not about things happening in the here and now. They're about all kinds of things happening in the mind or in the imagination. So we need to have some way of explaining the development of that trust needed for language to become viable, become a possible communicative strategy. And increasingly, I've realized that laughter is, of course, a very different thing from language. Laughter is a particular human species-specific vocalization. The kind of laughter that's characteristic of humans is quite unique to our species. And it certainly isn't language. But when everyone's had a good laugh, what happens is that in laughing together, we arrive at a situation where we're relaxed. I mean, and of course, we know this today, that you can't, it's difficult to laugh with your boss, it's difficult to laugh with your underlings. Wherever you've got dominance and submission, laughter is not really going to happen. And it's equally difficult to have a really honest or good conversation with people that you can't laugh with. And so even to this day, and this is a point that David Graeber, we've got all kinds of criticisms of David Graeber, he makes the point that there's something communistic about language itself. And we feel happiest and relaxed and most likely to want to talk to people when we can share a joke with them, where we can laugh with them. So I just want to mention what happens with the Bengeli, the people that Jerome Lewis, Mona Finnegan, studied, these so-called pygmies of the Congo forest. What happens is this, and it's great because it's kind of showing that, you know, it's wrong to have a view of hunter-gatherers as kind of rigidly egalitarian, rigidly communist, all well-behaved, all sticking to the rules. I mean, that's nowhere near what really happens among hunters and gatherers. It's far more liberated than that. So what happens is that men are quite often quite, you know, assertive and inappropriate in their behavior. So what happens is, supposing, and I'm just now describing what the way Jerome Lewis himself would describe it. Some man has been an idiot. He's been throwing his weight around. He's been telling people what to do when it's not his business to tell people what to do. He's making an idiot of himself. Maybe he's been imposing himself on some woman in a completely inappropriate way. And what happens is that sometime later on, maybe towards the evening, one of the older ladies in the camp will start to mimic his behavior. And without any words and without explaining who it is or what she's talking about, she'll just start taking on one of his idiosyncrasies and acting it out. He may have a certain kind of twitch, or he may scratch his neck in a certain way, but before long, everyone knows exactly who she's talking about. And then everyone starts to laugh because he does an exaggerated pantomime of this guy's behavior. And it's usually a guy, by the way. It doesn't have to be. It can be another woman. It can be a child. But, you know, the sort of prime example of what I'm going to be talking about is some man's been making an idiot of himself. And then soon this older lady, and it has to be an older lady because she's the one who will have the sort of privilege to be able to do this. If it was a man was to do this, it might be a fight. But when an older woman in the camp, a senior woman in the camp, a grandmother often, when she starts to mimic his behavior, she gets away with it. And soon her sisters and relatives I've got the joke, and they start mimicking the behavior as well. And it's not just gestural mime, it's also vocalization. They'll start making sounds similar to the snorts, the sneezes, the whatever it is he does. And then before long, all the girls and the boys are just laughing and laughing and laughing. And after a few minutes, everyone in the camp is laughing, with one exception. And that's the target of the laughter, of the humor. And he will get, of course, upset. And it's sort of the penny drops. Oh, it's me they're on about, you know. And two things. He can either just get out the way, or he can do something different. And what happens is the women just won't stop laughing. It'll go on for hours and hours and hours, and keep recurring every time he makes an appearance in the camp. And the women will continue laughing and acting out his behavior, and it's called mwajo, this performance, until something happens. And what's got to happen, and in this sense, you can see the sort of generosity and inclusiveness of the women's laughter, is he has got to get it. He's got to laugh. He's got to join in the laughter. And when he joins in the laughter, he's at last sort of joining the human race. He's now seeing himself as others seeing him. What he's laughing at is his own idiocy. And it's only then that the women will stop laughing, once he's joined in the laughter at his former self. And this ability to see yourself as others see you is, of course, the crucial thing which defines human consciousness. And in fact, Karl Marx made a very interesting point about that. And I'll just read out from Marx and Engels in 1845. And they're talking now about language. Although they're not talking about laughter here, they're talking about the ability to see yourself from an external perspective, to put yourself in others' shoes as they see you. And this is Marx and Engels on the origin of language. From the outset, spirit is cursed with the burden of matter, which appears in this case in the form of agitated layers of air, sounds, in short, of language. Language is as old as consciousness. Language is practical consciousness as it exists for other men, and thus as it really exists for myself as well. Language, like consciousness, only arises from the needs and necessity of intercourse with other men. And this was in 1845, anticipating the work of psychologists, evolutionary psychologists such as Michael Tomasello and many others, who now realize that you only are conscious when you can escape your own ego, when you can see yourself as others see you. And what I'm suggesting here from the work of Dasha Bombakova, one of Camilla's students and Jerome's students, a student of mine actually as well in Bratislava, what she's shown is that men and women become conscious of themselves through self-deprecating laughter. When they can join in a laugh at their own expense, that kind of shows that they're human. And from that ability to laugh at yourself and see yourself as others see you comes the possibility of language, because there's no way that language would be any use to anybody if you couldn't put yourself in others' shoes and see your own mind as reflected in the mirror provided by others around you. So mwajo, and the point of this is, by the way, just mwajo is the indigenous term for this kind of mimicry and pantomime and laughter, which is a kind of ritual in a sense, a kind of women's ritual, mostly women, not entirely women, men can do mwajo as well. But it's a kind of ritual, pantomime. And the reason I'm focusing on it so much is because it combines so many things. It combines humor, in a sense, with ritual, with resistance. The gestural mimicry and vocal mimicry is already in as many ways symbolic and metaphorical, because you're doing something not in real life, but in a kind of fictional domain. And of course, metaphor is the use of fictions to express truths. And it kind of, you can see how mwajo, this performance, kind of bottom-up resistance to any hint of male dominance, any hint of patriarchy, as kind of containing so many ingredients that already we've got packed in there somewhere, language, because the gestures and mimic sounds and the way in which they're understood are already in a sort of in a way linguistic. I mean, all you need to get to full language now is to start developing shorthands for those sounds and gestures, and before long you'll have fully complex grammatical language, which of course all hunter-gatherers have, despite certain people thinking that they don't. I'm thinking of John Zerzan and various other complete idiots who think that language is oppressive and hunter-gatherers don't have it, but we won't go there. Right. Now, okay, now and I want to now get into matriarchy from the standpoint of mythology, the myth of matriarchy. And the myth of matriarchy is a very important topic, partly because in the 19th century, Beethoven, and I think to some extent Engels and Morgan, sort of took the myth at face value. Myths are always interesting, and they're never just myths. There's always some element of truth in a myth. But of course, you can't. It's very important not to mix up ideological mythology with truth. Certainly not with scientific truth. So now, and let me just say, in the West at the moment, if we take our so-called science, and to me, science is, well, it's the one internationalist language we have as a species today. We have a thing called science, and it's spectacularly brilliant in so many ways. It's the one collectivist form of knowledge we have. Science is entirely collectivist. No scientist can just make up a claim and kind of get away with it without peer review, without being pulled down by countless colleagues trying to sort of level that particular scientist out and just check out whether the claim finding is true. So science is intrinsically internationalist. I would say intrinsically communist, intrinsically egalitarian, intrinsically accountable. Sometimes a so-called scientist manages to make a claim which actually doesn't work at all, and they manage to do that because they've got authority from an external source. And as comrades will know, I'm afraid to say that I think that Noam Chomsky is one of those. He had a version of linguistics, an idea about language being a digital computer, and concepts such as carburetor and so on being innate, installed in the human mind with the speciation of Homo sapiens. A lot of really strange things, which actually were for a period treated as science, but obviously, even Chomsky's own students very rapidly realized it was complete nonsense. But that Chomsky kind of got away with it because there was such institution, including military support. But genuine science is bottom up, collectivist. But as of course Engels and Marx pointed out, there's one problem with science, which is it never really connects things up. You never really get the big picture. Scientists are scattered, atomized, kind of inarticulate, not allowed to, when it comes to any political implications of their science. They never feel through their training that they're entitled to sort of get together and express their findings. I mean, we're discovering that particularly with today's climate science, where scientists are completely across the entire globe aware that capitalism is potentially actually destroying life on Earth. I mean, because if this gets exponential, it doesn't take very long for something like that bomb in Beirut to happen. In other words, the whole planet with all the huge amounts of frozen methane to just start to get so hot that the whole thing starts to explode, and we just get to absolutely impossible temperatures on this planet, way above, above 50. even above the boiling point of water if you're looking far enough ahead. So, and the point I'm making here is that scientists they're not encouraged to speak their mind. They're encouraged to just get on and do their little fragment of the work they're discovering, but putting the big picture together is frowned upon, and the politicians who claim to be able to sort of get the advice from the scientists and then make of it politically what they will. But still, science is science. It's collectivist. It's accountable, and at some point, of course, scientists in putting the big picture together, including the picture of the whole story of life on Earth, get to the issues of human origins and sex and gender. And in this part of the world, it is still kind of assumed by scientists, and I'm saying this in the sense that when I say scientists, most Darwinians, I would think, most paleoanthropologists, most figures that do have a voice, I'm thinking of, say, Steven Pinker, for example, there is a general assumption when it comes to thinking about human nature that male dominance is natural. Obviously, that could be quite subtle. There's not, it doesn't have to be a view that ferocious patriarchy of the kind that common chimps illustrate was always part of human history. But there's a general assumption that, and it kind of works out something like, well, come on, men are a bit stronger than women. Men can get together and organize politics in the ways which women aren't so free to do, because women have got childcare and babies to look after. There's a sort of sense in which women's place is the home, kind of inevitably because of the costs and burdens of pregnancy, childcare, nursing, and so forth. For one reason or another, men are bound to have an edge of dominance over the opposite sex. That tends to be the view, and sort of deep down, I think that is popular science, and it's in books, of course. It's in all kinds of books. So Richard Wrangham, the primatologist, is one of the main proponents of the view that despite the fact that, for example, another species of chimpanzee, in many ways more closely, in terms of behavior at least, and possibly even genetics, closely related to humans, is the bonobo, which are matriarchal. Bonobo females get together, of course. I'm sure commoners know this. There's never any instances of rape among bonobos, whereas rape is quite common among common chimpanzees. But despite the fact that the kind of matriarchy exists among bonobos, Richard Wrangham, very leading, very prominent primatologist, but so many other people keep on assuming that patriarchy is something which you can't change. It's just almost like saying there's 4 fingers and a thumb on each hand, and males tend to dominate over females for biological genetic reasons. And what I want to just touch on now is mythology, because it's so interesting to discover that across the world, across Papua New Guinea, across Australia, across Amazonia, across large parts of Africa, it's so interesting that the exact opposite view of human nature prevails. So across Papua New Guinea, across most of Australia, Amazonia, the view of men, and I want to make clear what I'm doing now. I'm talking about where you have a male monopoly of ritual power. So you have men's houses. You have a big men's house, sort of ritual space for men's secret. Men guard their secrets and perform their rituals in these places. Women are forbidden to enter them. You have these men's houses, and wherever you have this male monopoly of ritual power, the story goes that women are naturally superior to men. Women have a certain kind of magical potency, a sort of evil witchcraft potency, which has to be kept down by men using violence. So let me just read out a few of these myths. These are called myths of matriarchy. They're all over the world. Wherever you get a male monopoly of ritual power, the male story will be that originally women rule the world. And they rule the world because it was natural for them to do so. There's something about the female body which connected up women with each other and gave them an unfair advantage over men. And male power can only be maintained precariously through constant vigilance and terror. So let me just read out a couple of these stories. This is from Tierra del Fuego, a tribe called the Yamana, and it's called The Origin of the Kina. The Kina is this male ritual, and the Kina hut is this men's house. In the beginning, women had sole power. They gave orders to the men who obeyed, just as women do today. The men took care of the children. tended the fire, cleaned the skins, while the women did no work in the hut at all. That was the way it was always to be. The women invented the great Kina hut and everything which goes on inside it, and then fooled the men into thinking they were spirits. They stepped out of the great hut, painted all over, with masks on their heads. The men did not recognize their wives, who, simulating the spirits, beat the earth with dried skins so that it shook. Their yells, howls, and roars so frightened the men that they hastened into the huts and hid, full of fear. But one day, the Sun Man, who supplied the women's spirits in the Kina hut with an abundance of game, overheard the voices of two girls while he was passing a lagoon. Being curious, he hid in the bushes and saw the girls washing off painting, which was characteristic of the spirits when they appeared. They'd also been practicing their imitations of the voices of the spirits. Suddenly, the Sun Man confronted them, insisting that they reveal to him what went on in the Kina hut. Finally, they confessed to him, "It is the women themselves who paint themselves and put on masks. Then they step out of the hut and show themselves to the men. There are no other spirits in there. It is the women themselves who yell and howl. In this way, they frighten the men." So these women had sort of confessed. The Sun Man then returned to the camp and exposed the fraudulent women. In revenge, the men stormed the Kina hut and a great battle ensued in which the women were either killed or transformed into animals. From that time on, the men had performed in the Kina hut. They do this in the same manner as the women before them. And I could go through a whole list of them. I won't do it, haven't got time. But the origin of the bull roarer from the Kwavuru tribe in Papua New Guinea, the origin of the sacred flutes from the Baruya in Papua New Guinea, and so many other stories. And the reason I'm mentioning all this is because it's very, very clear, and it's actually explicit in the stories, that this original men's hut, when it was occupied by women, it was a menstrual seclusion hut. It was a special women's hut in which women would go when they were menstruating or when they were giving birth, and where they had their women's secrets, in much the same way, by the way, as the women's secrets of Ngoku I mentioned earlier on, that's still practiced today by the Benjeli. Women had this special enclosed space, a place of seclusion, and where they perform their sacred rituals. And so when men say women have this special power, which is a kind of unfair power because it's magical, it's absolutely clear from the myths that this power is the power of women to synchronize their cycles, their menstrual cycles, using the moon as a clock. So women have this power, which is a periodic power. As they bleed or share their blood together around dark moon, they have this kind of power of witchcraft, the terrifying power of their blood. And this was what's meant by women's rule in the stories. And the details of the stories make it absolutely clear. These are menstrual huts. And in particular, by the way, the story of the actually, maybe I should read this one out. This is a Marxist anthropologist actually who went to among the Baruya of Papua New Guinea. And perhaps I don't want to read all of it because it'll take too long. But one day a man hid to spy on the women in their sounds, wondering what these sounds were, these magical sounds of the flutes. So he discovered what was making these sounds. He saw several women, one of whom raised a piece of bamboo to her mouth and drew the sounds that the men had heard. Then the woman hid the bamboo beneath one of her skirts that she had hung in her house, which was a menstrual hut. The woman then left. The man drew near, slipped into the hut, searched around, found the flute, and raised it to his lips. He too brought forth the same sounds. Then he put it back and went to tell the other men what he had seen and done. When the women returned, she took out her flute to play it, but this time the sounds which she drew were ugly, so she threw it away, suspecting that the men must have touched it. Later the man came back, found the flute, and played it. Lovely sounds came forth, just like the ones which the woman had made. Since then, the flutes have been used to help boys to grow. And in this case, it's worth repeating the words of the ethnographer who recorded the story. And he says, the message of the myth is clear. In the beginning, women were superior to men. But one of the men, violating the fundamental taboo against ever penetrating into the menstrual hut or touching objects soiled with menstrual blood, captured their power and brought it back to men, who now use it to turn little boys into men. But this power, stolen from the women, is the very one that their vagina contains, the one given to them by their menstrual blood. The old women know the rough outlines of this myth and relate it to the young girls when they have their first period. And then finally, just in terms of this whole mythology about a hut in which women go, you can still find parts of the world where this actually happens to this day, meaning that we no longer need to rely on mythology. And I'm just writing here, I'll just read this out. It was in 2001 that a woman anthropologist was able to show that menstrual solidarity is to this day a living, thriving custom in one part of the world at least. So this is Wyn Maggie, who wrote a book describing what happens regularly to this day inside the Bashali. And this is a communal menstrual house used by women among the Kalasha people of all places, northwest Pakistan. You'd think that northwest Pakistan would be extreme versions of patriarchy, but no. And she was so surprised at what she found that she feared her Western readers might not believe her. So she explains, I don't want to make the mistake of leading you to believe that women always achieve mystic solidarity simply by virtue of sharing time in the menstrual house. Yet one of the delightful things for me at least is that for a few days, women whose paths otherwise rarely cross find things in common. The Bashali is a place of intense physical intimacy where women share knowledge about their bodies that would be unthinkable in everyday life. And she called her book, Our Women Are Free, because this is what men proudly say of their women in this part of the world. Women in the Kalasha Valley consider themselves free, whether married or not. Men are not just supportive, but proud of the fact that the women are free to travel, free to resist men's demands. There are no isolated menstrual huts. Instead, there is a large and well-built sacred building serving as a communal meeting house for the women who see it as the physical center for their solidarity and freedom. Women congregate here when menstruating or giving birth, so that at any one time there may be as many as 20 women inside, gossiping, laughing, singing together, many with their babies and toddlers. During their stay in what they call their most holy place, women compare notes on the duration of their menstrual flows. And so in the Kalasha Valley, there are no men's houses and no temples, and the communal menstrual house is the most sacred building there is. And this does give substance to these stories, that that everywhere you get a male men's house or even a temple, the blood inside that temple, of course, you can think of Christianity with a huge emphasis on blood. The myths are claiming that all these men's houses where men bleed, and of course, comrades should know that when men do perform these rituals, one of the things they get up to is to bleed as much as they can to prove that they've got as much power as women, although it is difficult for men to menstruate, but you can always do it by banging your nose enough times or cutting your arms or legs or even subincising a penis. You can see how what these myths of primordial matriarchy are saying. They're saying that once women ruled because of their blood, and then men had to steal that power. But it doesn't really matter whether you think they're their historical records or not. Of course, they're not their mythology, but the men know what they're doing today. That what they're doing today by acting out childbirth, by acting out menstruation in these secret houses built on the model of a menstrual house, is they are today, as continuously, if you like, stealing a kind of power which you can just see immediately is intrinsically appropriate for women. It's not natural for men to be menstruating or giving birth, whereas it is natural. And of course, Marx was pointing this out in the passage I read out a little earlier. These kinds of expressions of power are natural to women. It's most unlikely that menstrual synchrony was invented by men. It's much more likely that if menstrual synchrony exists, if women can combine their cycles by getting together, using the moon as a clock, that was a female strategy. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, if women ruled by that means, it would have been periodic. It would have been once a month period of women's rule, followed by a period of men's rule, but playful men's rule. So this would be rule by the moon. And to me, the idea of rule by the moon is actually more exciting and interesting than the idea of either rule by men or rule by women. This would be the kind of periodic rule which is intrinsic to our evolution. There's something about comrades will know, of course, that it's extremely unlikely that you'd get life on a planet. And the reason why we have life on this, it's not even to say that we have life on planet Earth. I mean, planet Earth is made of life. All the rocks are previous organisms, of course, and the atmosphere and everything about this planet is actually made up out of life. But this certainly wouldn't have happened if right at the beginning of the formation of this planet, we hadn't collided with another planet at a particular, extremely unlikely angle, which tipped the planet into a spin, which stabilized the axis of the planet. There's all kinds of things about the moon. We're an Earth, Sun, Moon system. Nobody thinks the sun isn't important, but the moon's important as well. And there's absolutely no doubt that in the human case, our evolution was intrinsically linked with different forms of periodicity day, night is one form, the changing of the seasons is another form, but of course the waxing and waning of the moon was absolutely central. And in many ways, what's happened with patriarchy is that we lost touch with those rhythms which actually made us the species we are. And I've always thought it would be quite a good idea, if we ever did get to communism, to actually restore, instead of the kind of time is money clocks that govern the world today, where we all have these clocks actually designed to, if you like, to, time. If you think time is money, you're constantly thinking you've got to save time. You haven't got time to look after the children, to play with them, to do your gardening, to have long, slow sex. Time is money, time is money, time is money. Well, under communism, we wouldn't think time is money. And we think actually time is the most valuable thing there is. Give us some time. Capitalism doesn't let us have any time at all. Time is almost the resource we're most robbed of under 24/7 capitalism. So getting back to the slow rhythm of the moon will be a huge liberation, and which would, of course, be, among other things, the liberation of women.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very enjoyable talk. We've already got some questions in the chat, which I'll try and formulate at some point. We are now in the process, comments, if Ollie and Emil could start to move comments over from attendees into panelists. This may take a few minutes, as I said, so please don't panic if you disappear for a brief second. Could I take this opportunity as well to remind comrades of the CPGB YouTube channel, youtube.com/C/Communist Party of Great Britain. You can not only see the live stream of these events, but you can also find the videos of the entire sessions from this week if you've missed any. And there are plans afoot to actually archive the entirety of our videos from communist universities over the years. So Chris will feature a few times in those. So yeah, youtube.com/C/Communist Party of Great Britain. We're still waiting for people to be moved over. It will take a few more seconds. If you are already on the panel and would like to express your interest to speak, then please do. There's no problem in letting me know now already. I have asked Ben to express his questions, but maybe I can do that for him at some point. There's a lot in the chat, Chris, but I know from doing these talks myself, it's slightly off-putting when there's all loads of stuff in the chat and you're speaking. So we'll get round to them, I'm sure, in some form in a second. We're almost all over. There's only 6 attendees left. 5, 4, 3. We haven't got to 2 yet. So yes, please, comrades, don't be shy. If you would like to express interest to speak or ask any questions, then please do come forward. We're all over. Hello. There's something in the chat. Simon Francis would like to ask a question. Simon Francis, over to you.
Okay, yeah. Now you just said that you think rule by the moon is a more appropriate, a more exciting term than either rule by women or by men. But to interact with the labels and the language as they exist today, I've got a question about, how revolutionaries, how activists should really perceive themselves, because I believe it was Sheila McGregor who accused Lionel Sims and Rag of trying to bring in feminism into the Socialist Workers' Party by the back door. Duncan Hallis apparently said that she would do better to take on the arguments around things like sex strike theory rather than make that assertion. However, was there a bit of truth in what Sheila McGregor was saying? She attempts to say, in a positive sense, I mean, we can interpret it in a positive way, kind of the opposite of what she was from her point of view. Now, she has said that gender equality has existed because both sexes did useful work, but she won't accept any of these ideas about dominance, counter-dominance, and so on. But it seems to me that you kind of do imply with the theories that the initiative for collective provision of energy and the democratization of sexual access, it seems to come from females. The development of the sex strike, what made us human, it actually does kind of spring from the female. now you argue that recent genetic studies demonstrate matrilocal residence. That's consistent with the theory of sex strike. But you also say that, yes, it's true that men and women have to fight alongside each other to try and overturn the capitalist system. But women kind of contribute more than that, in a sense. You said, look at they can be the key catalyst in revolutionary struggle. For example, you quoted the March on Versailles. The role of women in 1917 was very, very key at the beginning of that process. Does this imply that a more accurate term for revolutionary should be socialist feminist rather than simply socialist or communist? It's certainly the conclusion, interestingly, that Sharon Smith eventually reached, is the conclusion she reached in the end, when she was still in the when the old Cliffite ISO, International Socialist Organization, existed. So I'd be interested what you think of that. It's just a way of concretizing the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I would like to invite Chris Gray to speak next, please, Chris.
Okay, can you hear me, comrades?
Yeah,
yes.
great.
Fine, thanks. Thanks very much, Chris, for that, as usual, up-to-date, informed presentation. I just have a couple of questions. You mentioned Marx and Engels writing in 1845. Can you give us the exact title of the work they were producing at that time? That would be useful. And secondly, could you give the name of the author of the book Our Women Are Free, which I didn't catch, please? That's it.
Thank you, Chris. I'll bring in Anne McShane and then maybe bring Chris Knight back briefly. We'll see how things unfold. Anne, you have the floor.
Okay, I suppose it won't surprise anybody that I put up my hand so quickly into this debate, because obviously this is a question, women's emancipation is a question which I have always, throughout my political life, been, I suppose, dedicated to, really. And I suppose like a lot of that comes from the political conclusions that your personal experiences lead you to. And growing up as a woman in Ireland in the 1980s in particular was, I would say, an extremely, well, it was a repressive experience in many respects because of the attitude of the church to women's rights, the lack of a voice, but also there were many other countervailing experiences in terms of women's solidarity within, I suppose, family and other, I suppose, more personal spheres, women's support for each other. Now, really, just to come to what Chris was saying, I think it's very interesting, you know, this whole question of women's power and it being seen as a danger, being presented as a danger. I suppose first you said it was misrepresented, i.e. that they portrayed women as having been in charge and having subjugated men, and now men had to prevent that happening again, rather than what you believe it to be the case of it being a more contested space. Because, you know, you think much of the language, you know, of like she's an old dragon, especially for older women like myself, who wouldn't be afraid to speak out, or, you know, the idea that you often get, and this is not talking, I'm not talking about people in politics so much, but in personal life, family and whatever, the fear of women, oh, look, she's going to castrate you because she's getting too dominant, you need to have a word with her. That poor man, which is something which is often said about my husband, that poor man, how does he cope? You know, I mean, but really, honestly, these kinds of things are never said the other way around, but obviously there is some history, you know, I'm just saying that there's some cultural history that comes from that fear of women's dominance. Women are often seen as emotional, men are seen as rational, women are like not to be trusted in positions of power. And then just, I think I think that we have a real issue on the left today. We still have an enormous issue on the women's question, a huge problem. Male dominance basically is the modus operandi of all left groups. Women are generally few in numbers. Women are often not listened to in the same way that men are listened to. Obviously, left-wing groups are part of society and reflect that society, but I think that we need to make a very conscious effort to overcome that, to promote and encourage and enable young women coming into organizations, not to shut them up as silly women, silly young girls, but actually to promote them and to empower them. And this is because I think that the way in which our organizations work, the cultural kind of context for our organization is extremely important in terms of how we think and how we fight, so that issues that are, which is why I said at the beginning that I came to politics because of my personal experiences. I think that things that are outside of your experience sometimes aren't addressed. So sometimes women's issues are looked at as sectional rather than as being universal issues for us all as human beings. For instance, domestic violence, which is an extremely important question, which has re-emerged in Western society because of the pandemic, is something that us as communists, we need to be saying something, to be doing something on. I think, yes, I mean, I think that what Chris has presented is extremely interesting and gives us an insight in terms of how our society, how human beings began, how we became human. And I think it's a great shame that outside of your group, Chris, there's been so little done by Marxists on the question, which, you know, the arguments and, the research that Engels did and him and Babel wrote about, the exceptions being Clara Zetkin and Alexander Kollontai, who did do that work. But generally, we, as Marxists, I think, need to develop, now not to find a direct connection, you know, because obviously we live in a very different society, but nevertheless, to make the connections and draw the lessons from those experiences in terms of how we approach politics and society today, because I think I certainly don't want a male-dominated socialism. I want a matriarchal socialism. I don't think that we should be looking at the woman question as something that will come about as a consequence of economic development, i.e. when we have the money to afford the nurseries and the equal pay, but that it's something that needs to be inculcated into our organization and our methods from the very beginning. So therefore, and I'm just going to finish on this, I've been criticized before because it's been argued that I've been myself overcritical of the Bolsheviks because of their lacking on the women's question. My point is not that they could have afforded financially to provide a lot of things to women, but not that, but that they failed to see the importance of women's involvement in all organizations, all initiatives of the revolution from the very beginning. So for instance, we hear the other day from Lars Lee of a conference, the Soviet conference in March 1917, that there were no women present as delegates. This is just a month after the February Revolution. And I don't agree, by the way, that the women that came out on whether it's been said or not, but I want to make it clear that the women who came out in the February Revolution were politicized women. They were not just acting emotionally. They were political women. The fact that they were not drawn in immediately to the Soviets to the extent that they would be delegates at that conference is a great shame, is a great failure. So I think the reason I'm making these points now is because I think that these are issues that we need to address. And I think that we need to understand that socialism has to be about, as a universal task, it has to be about creating equality between the sexes, in the sense of us being able to challenge each other and not having one sex feeling that they're dominant and able to put the other sex down. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Can I come back before we get too many? Because
I was going to suggest that, Chris. I think I've got a number of speakers. If I give you about 5 or 6 minutes, I have to be relatively strict because there is quite a lot of interest. Is that okay?
Do be strict, yes.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, very interesting from Simon about the SWP. So I imagine, Simon, have you got some experience of life within the SWP? It's all fascinating to me. Just very briefly, what happened was that initially, following the publication of my book and Lionel Sims's endorsement of the basic argument, Lionel having been maybe their main speaker on these issues of Engels and origin of the family, initially there was a huge support from the SWP for the idea that my book had actually vindicated Engels. And what happened was that I think it was the Hackney branch of the SWP, Honey Rosenberg, massively supported it all. This is Tony Cliff's partner. There's huge meetings, a huge enthusiasm about this whole thing. It's like at last, a Marxist, Lionel in particular, and their own comrades in particular, found up-to-date scientific endorsement. Engels got it right. And then shortly afterwards, sort of alarm bells began to ring. So initially, okay, we have a sex strike, but it's kind of okay. It's in the Ice Age, perhaps it's a long time ago. But at this stage, of course, the SWP was involved in huge disputes internally over women's voice and various other things, and will back me up on all this because the same old thing started to happen. And then they began to sort of say, yeah, well, all right, but I mean, if you're going to start talking about sex strike, well, we're going to get women in the SWP organising separately and maybe even having a sex strike. Oh my horrors. And then suddenly there was a huge shift back into an absolute extraordinary denunciation of the whole theory. From I won't go into it all, Chris Harman, Sheila McGregor, a whole bunch of people, of course. And then there was this debate, so-called debate with Lionel Sims in the Marxism which followed. And there was a shocking amount of heckling, barracking, accusations of feminism and God knows what else going on. And then very shortly afterwards, it was just about every single anthropologist in the SWP was hauled up to have a sort of Star Chamber meeting with senior comrades present, including Tony Cliff, of course. And then what happened was that it was made very clear to Ian Watts, Lionel Sims, a whole lot of other SWP members. Anyone caught reading, mentioning, talking about Chris Knight's blood relations, you're immediately going to be expelled. And most of the anthropologists in the SWP left at that point. Lionel decided to kind of stay in as a kind of sleeper and kind of carry on campaigning for the issues, but not make too much of an open fuss about it all. So there's this astonishing degree of control from a bunch of, not just men, of course, there were plenty of women involved in this as well, as we've mentioned with Sheila McGregor. And the idea, of course, was that this is a stalking horse for feminism. Lionel's allowing feminism in through the back door. I mean, my view is probably very similar to Anne's view. I mean, if we come across in my activism a worker who is a woman, a shop steward, and she describes herself as a feminist, I think, well, probably she's on the right side. Probably she's pretty much a socialist as well. Obviously, there's such a thing as bourgeois feminism, and my whole book was organised against bourgeois feminism. I make it very, very clear in the book that all those issues. But I don't want, the idea that feminism is some sort of horrific bourgeois ideology. No, feminism is a massive different ideology. Some bourgeois, some proletarian, and for most workers who decide that they're perhaps feminists, it just means exactly what Anne's saying. Give women a voice. We're equal to you. And of course, it is true, isn't it, that in nearly all the major revolutions, women have played, initially at least, a leading role, and then subsequently, of course, they've lost the power to a much more male-dominated outcome from that initially optimistic revolution. Chris Cray, just very briefly, it's very simple. It's 1844, isn't it, the actual date? Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, The Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts was the passage I quoted from. And the author of the book, Our Women Are Free, is Win Maggie, M-I-G-G-I-E. Our Women Are Free is the title of the book. And as far as responding to Anne, I mean, all I can say is hats off. I mean, I completely agree with you, really. I mean, obviously we can all make excuses about the Bolsheviks. They weren't in the easiest of conditions. They're huge, a lot of sort of patriarchal legacy they had to deal with. You can't make a revolution sort of overnight in terms of all the cultural hangovers and traditions. But I mean, it's completely wrong to sort of gloss over the huge failings on that level of even the most, brilliant class fighters the world has seen in so many ways, the Bolsheviks. I mean, on that level, I totally agree. I totally agree with Anne. And of course, it is astonishing and shocking the degree to which the issues which actually motivated Marx and Engels have been so ignored. And actually, the SWP and the militant and all these various other tendencies on the left, particularly the so-called Trotskyist ones, actually, I would say, there were very, very, very few exceptions. They all pretty much have internalized the bourgeois idea that Engels has been disproved by modern anthropology. Instead of investigating and looking up at the genetics and investigating the details, there's a kind of general view that on that one, Engels got it wrong. There was no such thing. The whole issue of matrilineal clans and matriarchy and stuff isn't even treated as part of the Marxist canon. And the best you get in the SWP these days is some idea of some kind of, equality between the sexes, but they do not defend Engels. They absolutely don't defend Engels. And yet, of course, what it's turned out that in essence, on the issues which actually matter, Engels got it more right than any other figure writing in his time. And even to this day, The Origin of the Family and Private Property in the State is a magnificent contribution which everyone should read. It's still in many ways the best thing ever written.
Thank you very much, Chris. Next speaker is Mike McNair.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for a very interesting talk. I had a couple of things which are sort of picky edge things. One is I raised it with Camilla the other day as well. The possibility of class societies internalizing the form of the ritual of the anti-dominance ritual as a sort of safety valve come carnival come illustration of why the old order, why the existing order has to be maintained, and the Athenian festival of the Chronia, and other Athenian festivals which involve the Chronia is like the Saturnalia in Rome. It's the overthrow of the upside down society, upside down, but also there are women's festivals of the same sort. And then, so in the sense that the ritual, the idea of a periodic ritual inversion can be something which maintains the old order, or not maintains the old order, but serves as a tolerability of the old order. Just purely a question. The myth of the Amazonomachy doesn't seem to be the same sort of myth. The myth of the Amazons doesn't seem to be quite, to the extent it is a myth, doesn't seem to be quite the same sort of myth as the menstrual hut myths, which you've been talking about in this. And there's a question, what's that doing? Is this again another form of the myth of matriarchy, a different form of the myth of matriarchy, as say, though it isn't exactly matriarchy, as a form, and the lunar, again, Greece had a lunar calendar with periodic intercalations of months. Ancient Greece had a periodic lunar calendar with periodic and arbitrary intercalations of months. Rome, a lunar solar calendar with, but the sense that the calendar becoming fully solar, doesn't seem to be modern. Is it? How far is it that it's actually modern? How far is it that it's driven? It's Egyptian, and it's driven by the need to organise agriculture around the annual Nile flood, so that in consequence you actually need the fucking solar calendar for very immediate and practical reasons, which is also in fact true of northern Europe more than it is of Rome. That the forms of the climate, general climate, mean that for the purpose of doing agriculture you need a solar calendar. Questions though, just on the SWP issue. I think that there's two sides to this. One of which is this is about the Cliffites' regime of what democratic centralism means is military top-down control, and we have to have military top-down control of the women's organisations, just as we have to have military top-down control of the branches, and any sort of ideology which would call into question our right to have military top-down control of the women's organisations by the quote cadre unquote is subversive. And the fight about women's voice is at the end of the day defence of the right of the cadre, the full-timers, to have control. But the other side of it is that when this is going on, this is actually at the same time as B. Campbell and these guys arguing against the miners' strike and for feminism as a reason to reject class altogether, and feminism as a ground of radical Eurocommunism, and then feminism as a ground against the miners' strike, and then we get feminism as a ground of Blairism in the Labour Party. And indeed, we've got right now, we have had, it didn't somehow kick off quite as successfully, but before they started with the anti-Semitism campaign, there was a campaign against the left is insufficiently feminist campaign run by right-wingers in the Labour Party. So that I think is also part of, it's the sort of the SWP's method prevents them from saying, yes, there is feminism, which is right and necessary, but nonetheless, there is this stuff. The final one, and this is an interesting and big political problem. Domestic violence is exacerbated by the lockdown response to COVID. Does that imply that we should, and I think it possibly does imply that we should have supported the Swedish approach on the basis that the costs of atomization and destruction of solidarity by the lockdown approach to COVID outweigh the risks of a whole load of the elderly dying as a result of the spread of the infection? And there's a real issue. I'm not saying this is in order to argue against what you're saying. I'm saying that it's there's a real political issue there about solidarity, which goes back to Chris's stuff, because Chris's stuff is about ritual and the construction of solidarity and against atomization. And the issue about how the state's responses to the pandemic are about imposing atomization, it seems to me, is an important one. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. Sorry, I was on the wrong screen there trying to organize something else. Next is, I think, Jim Ring. You said you would like to speak, but then you've written in chat, so I just want to check if you'd like to verbalize your questions.
Yeah, I will do that.
Thank you, Jim.
Let you see my face, if I can. There I am. Okay. Hello, Chris.
Hello. Good.
I was intrigued by some of what Camilla said, and this sort of long predates a lot of the discussion you have, because what the discussion you have is really post New Stone Age stuff, isn't it, really? although I guess a lot of it is still to do with hunter-gatherer societies.
No, it's pre-Neolithic. Mostly my stuff is Paleolithic.
Yeah,
Not
okay,
Neolithic.
right. Okay, well, three things that Camilla mentioned and you mentioned. One was about the human eye. And I'd say that to some extent, the way early humans also lost the hair covering to their upper faces. Now, what that did, from what Camilla seems to be saying, is that enabled them, without verbal communication, to have a communication between individuals that was, I wouldn't say the word democratic, I would say more or less interpersonal communication, which was to some extent lost in the apes. And she thought that was she seemed to think that was a fundamental advance in the ability of humans to change the way they ran their society. Then you mentioned laughter, and laughter is also one of those things that requires a kind of an evolutionary thing to do. So at some point in our human evolution, we were able to laugh and therefore to communicate not just in a normal non-verbal way, but also to express emotions and feelings far more. And then we go to one stage further, which I'm really interested in, I think you are as well, Chris, is the beginning and evolution of speech itself. And from what I've been reading, one of the things that is essential for speech is to be able to articulate at least 3 vowel sounds. And so some point in human evolution, fairly late on, maybe post-Neanderthal, Homo sapiens sapiens was able to articulate proper speech as we understand it now. And to me, that meant singing as well as a vital ingredient of communication. So it gave us as a species all those abilities to be able to communicate in the way that was necessary for your kind of matriarchal society to thrive. And a quick aside to that, I know we talk about Chomsky and his idea that the brain somehow changed, but maybe these fairly minor evolutionary steps were also an essential part, and in a way, maybe he was right.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to bring in one more speaker, Chris, and then bring you back if that's okay. Next speaker is Peter Manson. Peter, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Chris. It's difficult to understate the value of the contributions to the Radical Anthropology Group to all this theory, but I'd like to basically put a question that I also put to Camilla a couple of days ago. Okay, well, we've learned that even under original communism, or primitive communism, if you want to call it that, then there was this kind of inbuilt struggle between women and men, that women, they had to impose their matriarchy as a kind of defensive collective organization against the power of individual men. And then subsequently under class society, that's taken patriarchal forms. What does this say about both about the present and about the future communist order? I mean, for example, is it possible today to have a completely equal male-female individual relationship in a marriage or whatever? It does seem to me that is possible, without sort of either side having to, or without the woman involved having to organize collectively with other women. And what about in the future communist order? Will we still have women organizing collectively to protect their separate interests from those of men? Or will we be able to move beyond that? Will we be able to move beyond power based on gender so that all people can be viewed as individuals irrespective of the ethnicity, the gender, the sexuality, and all the rest of it. Shouldn't that be our aim? In other words, leave behind both matriarchy and patriarchy. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Chris, another 3, 4, 5 minutes, something like that, if that's okay.
Mike, on calendars, do we need a solar calendar, and if so, when did this need arise? Well, I mean, the real expert on this is Lionel Sims, who's really become a major figure in interpreting megalithic monuments such as Stonehenge and Avebury and many others. And those monuments are all about, in Lionel's analysis, and I think he's absolutely right on this, they're all about managing the transition from an essentially lunar calendar to an increasingly solar calendar, because obviously once you abandon hunting as the main mode of subsistence and move into herding with seasonal breeding of animals, and then eventually agriculture with enormous emphasis on seasonality, as you said, Mike, I mean, in connection with the Nile, I mean, increasingly there's an absolutely like technological, economic requirement to switch over to a solar calendar. And Lionel's point is that in order to make that transition possible without appearing to be betraying the ancient lunar calendar, but betraying fidelity to the moon, was to solarize the moon. So I think it's extremely convincing the way Lionel describes this. Stonehenge is an extraordinary machine for presenting the sun as a version of the moon. It's like, so the month becomes stretched out into a year, and the years become stretched out into 8 very long periods when, if you like, all the sort of clocks are reset every 18 and a bit years. I mean, a fantastic, genius interpretation of Avebury and Stonehenge. So anyone interested should just look up Lionel's work. It's very much, it's very much part of the debates on the meaning of those megalithic monuments. But Mike also just mentioned, whether, in terms of Ngoku and other women's rituals, are these just sort of safety valves, more or less like the Saturnalia or Carnival? Well, yes, I mean, that's what they can become. But with the Benjeli, the people that I was mentioning, that Jerome Lewis has been working with, and Mona Finnegan, there's no way that Ngoku is as compensation. I mean, women really do seize power in a quite aggressive, assertive, even a playful and humorous way, a very sexy, raucous way. Women actually take the power. But of course, what is true is that as patriarchy in different areas for different reasons, different sort of detailed reasons, emphasizes the, if you like, the male rituals at the expense of the female ones, it doesn't done all at once. So increasingly the female rituals are made less frequent. They only happen maybe once a year instead of once a month. And then of course, once they are once a year, they're still considered necessary for fertility, for the fertility of women, maybe for the crops, to at least once a year, to kind of restore the dynamic which actually got human culture, underway. So, so it's, I agree, Carnival or Saturnalia or the Feast of Fools, and so on. These are kind of compensatory, but it's kind of better than nothing. But they're a glimpse of how life used to be, and of course what happens with these events as they become more and more, as you say, compensatory and less frequent. And on the Amazons, well, I mean, yes, I mean, so what tends to happen is when these, I mentioned a few matriarchy myths. In all those matriarchy myths, the accusation which men make against the women is that they were acting like men. They weren't being properly feminine. They were doing men's things. They were, and of course the ultimate men's thing is to hunt. Well, actually, the funny thing is that even among egalitarian hunter-gatherers like the Benjeli, it's quite extraordinary, but women, they don't hunt and they do hunt. So, for example, Jerome Lewis will be describing how traditionally the Benjeli, with their spears, they were so brave that they could even hunt elephants. But what happened was that the women would first, in ritual, capture the spirit of the elephant, tie it up. They would then, in their singing, know that they've sort of captured that elephant in spirit. They would know roughly where the elephant was, and then they would just tell the men, right, okay, well, we've done the important bit. You go and with your spears and actually bring back that elephant. So women are kind of hunters in the sense that they manage the hunt. And there's like two stages of the hunt. One's to accompany the hunt in imagination, in ritual, and then do the sort of physical work. It's almost as if women are the management of the hunt. That's a good way of putting it. So the myth of the Amazons is another one of those where the women they cut off a breast, of course, in order to be able to, the breast doesn't get in the way of the bowstring, and they're kind of women who are, they've taken off part of their femininity in order to be powerful. But of course, it's the whole thing about the Amazons was a myth, but sort of based on like a slight tweak based on those very ancient and pretty much universal myths of the time when women ruled. On feminism, I mean, I don't see any difference between feminism and socialism. I mean, if somebody tells me feminism is all sorts of things, some extremely racist, reactionary, patriarchal, whatever, reformist, Blairite, therefore we've got to be very careful of feminism. Well, sorry, does that not apply to socialism? Can't you have Blairite forms of socialism? Can't the word socialism mean all kinds of things under the sun, no different from feminism? I mean, of course, I don't. Why on earth feminism should be more of a bogey word than socialism, given the uses to which the word socialism has been put under people like Tony Blair and of course Keir Starmer now. I don't really get it. I don't know why a particular opprobrium needs to be attached to feminism as opposed to socialism, given that all of these things can mean so many different things under different class pressures, reactionary and progressive. The only person I really disagree with is my good friend Jim Ring. I really disagree with Jim on almost everything he said. So, I mean, I don't know, where do I start? I mean, the stuff about 3 vowel sounds and that Neanderthals couldn't make 3 vowel sounds and therefore they couldn't talk. It's just complete gibberish, Jim. I mean, there was a theory by somebody called Lieberman years and years ago to explain why Neanderthals couldn't speak and why they became extinct, and they couldn't make enough vowel sounds because they didn't have a descended larynx. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. The Neanderthals could not only make 3 vowel sounds, they did art and ritual, and they had slightly larger brains than humans. There may be slight differences between modern humans and Neanderthals, but they really made the revolution. Got into culture. They were sophisticated, intelligent people, and there's no doubt whatever that the Neanderthals had fully complex language. When you say Chomsky might have been right, no, Jim, he was not right. I don't know how to put that more bluntly. Darwinism doesn't work with random mutations. You don't suddenly get a language gene. You get selection pressures which work. The principle of Darwinism is descent with modification. You have to have a precursor, and then they work modifications on that precursor. You have to have a starting point. Chomsky's theory is you don't have a starting point. Language comes from nowhere. It emerges in an instant, in perfect form, instantaneously. There's a mutation. Maybe he says that some ape man was wandering around and got into it was hit by a cosmic ray shower, and this cosmic ray shower installed a language organ, which not only had all the world's grammars installed in it, but all the words like carburetor and email and everything else, all in one instant. I mean, it is utter nonsense. There's not one single part of Chomsky's theory which makes the slightest sense, Jim. On the eye, it isn't Camilla's theory. That's another mistake, Jim. The whole idea of the eyes is an absolutely standard idea which Camilla was referring to. So 2 Japanese primatologists about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, just did a study of eyes in monkeys, apes, gorillas, and humans. And it just turns out that there's a huge difference. All the other primates have got these strange dark on dark eyes. They're designed not to let you look into them. They're designed to not, especially with the adults, like an adult, think of an adult gorilla. It's, you don't know what on earth it's looking at. It doesn't want you to know because it doesn't want you to read its mind. So the thing about the human eye is that we must have evolved that eye under selection pressures for transparency. There must have been some way in which our genetic fitness, our reproductive fitness, was enhanced by being mind read. The more others could read what you're thinking, the more likely you were to have surviving offspring. But with a gorilla, it's the other way around. You don't want anyone to read your mind because they're going to trick you. If you're an adult male gorilla guarding your harem, you definitely don't want others to read your mind. And the way Camilla put it was, it's like mobsters wearing sunglasses. You wear sunglasses because you want to look out at the world, but you don't want the world looking out at you. Otherwise, they might work out where you stash the cash. So I'm sorry, Jim. I really, before talking about any of these things, you need to do at least a tiny little bit of reading on some of these issues. Peter, Okay, that's a very interesting contribution, Peter. I'm really, a huge lot of stuff, which obviously I can't really deal with. But I suppose the main point you're making is a very good question. Must it be, even in the future, even with a communist future, must women be in a position where they always have to fight back? Can't there be a time when we've just got there and where women don't have to keep on struggling? That's a very profound point. But I'll answer it by saying that hunter-gatherer egalitarianism, the way we all understand it now, and when I say we, I don't really mean RAG, I mean any hunter-gatherer specialist these days will describe hunter-gatherer egalitarianism as these people are assertively egalitarian. Now, it doesn't mean they sit back because they've got a system called egalitarianism or communism and they don't have to do anything about it. Under egalitarian communism, there's constant vigilance. There's nothing more complex and intellectually demanding and politically demanding than maintaining egalitarianism. It's just that egalitarian hunter-gatherers they're given the conditions of economic abundance where it becomes possible for them to be constantly on the lookout, constantly vigilant. But don't think that they just lie back and say, oh, we've got communism now, we don't have to bother. No, every single morning, every single day, people are on the lookout because there is a certain tendency in humans derived from our primate ancestors to be selfish and competitive and to dominate. And that's constantly kind of present and yet constantly resisted. So I would simply say the same, I think, applies to gender egalitarianism. The thing is that the question is, even today, everyone kind of, there's a sense of huge indignation among ordinary people across the world at the vast inequalities of wealth. But it doesn't matter how indignant you are. The fact is these bastards can get away with it. and I don't doubt that chimpanzee females and subordinate chimpanzee males will feel, there's a huge amount of sort of indignation and resistance to the alpha male dominance. But the trouble is the overarching subsistence system means that the dominant males, kind of get away with it. The resistance is never sufficient to overturn the whole system. So to my mind, something like lunarchy, something like a system where women have the chance to, I suppose I would put it this way. I don't think it's a burden on those Bengali women to sort of exactly have to once a month maybe organize their ritual, come out, dance, sing, laugh, tease, invade the men's camp, turn the world upside down. I don't think they feel that as a sort of unpleasant, oh, here we go again, we've got to deal with those bloody men again. I think they like it. I think it's fun. I think revolution is enjoyable. If revolution is really fun, if turning the world upside down is the most enjoyable thing you can do, why not do it several times? Why do it just once and then leave this revolution to, seep back into the increasingly distant past? If revolution is enjoyable, and if revolution is actually necessary in order to keep, the ideals of the revolution in place, why do it just once? Why not win the revolution, lose it on purpose, but lose it only within a brief period of time, sufficient to actually win the revolution again and again and again. So what women do, as far as I can work out, they like losing the revolution. They like a sort of playful version of counter-revolution, as long as that playful counter version of, rule of men, it doesn't take the piss. As long as men are only allowed to, quote, rule in a playful way for a few days, maybe have a good time, plenty of sex going on while men are ruling. But don't let them take the piss. Don't let them outstay their welcome. It's fun to overthrow them. It was fun last time we did it. It was a good laugh. Let's have that laugh one more time.
Thank you, Chris. I have two more speakers and then one speaker's indicated for a second round. So if you do want to come in, please do let me know. The next two speakers will be Geraldine and Liz Shirley. So Geraldine first, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's just very quick. It's basically, thank you very much, Chris. On derogatory remarks about women, there are a host of words. I did an experiment with some students I had when I taught at the London College of Furniture. They were apprentices from industry. And they started talking about girls. I said, okay, give me the names. What sort of words do you call girls? And then I asked them what sort of words they called boys. And there was hardly any derogatory word for the boys, but there was a whole list of derogatory words for girls. So that just is another example. And Anne expressed very well and very clearly women's condition today. I'd just like to illustrate a wee bit further and may just make a couple of observations. I've written it in the chats, Mary Baird's book, Women and Power, is also very interesting and useful. She, in one of the bits, I'm sure every woman in this conference here will be able to recall a time when they sat in a committee with men and women and made an observation or a comment or a suggestion which was met with deathly silence, and then shortly after a man would say exactly the same thing. Great applause. And I mean, it's happened to me. I know it's happened to pretty well everyone I know. It's happened to Mary Baird and loads. So it's just another subtle example. And what's the other thing I was going to say? Well, it can't have been very important. But it's just, oh yes, I know. How women feel with discrimination. Well, we're pretty tough. I think we've stood a lot of put downs over the years, all our lives. I mean, I knew a young actress, and when she went for auditions, she read the male speeches in Shakespeare. She used those because they were much more interesting than the female speeches. And she wanted to be able to show her full range of talents. So that was, I thought, a very interesting observation. And I mean, we've had a lot of abuse and things hurled at us on the streets and everything, I'm sure. But one time I felt it really in the pit of my stomach, and you might laugh because there were 4 of us playing golf in Troon, and golf's a big game in Scotland, and everybody goes and plays on the golf clubs, on the golf courses. But we went past the Royal Golf Club of Troon, I think it's called the Royal Troon Golf Club, and went inside and just had a look around. And there was a bar upstairs. There was one man sitting at the window and a barmaid. And I sort of said, oh, let's sit down and have a drink. And I started going through the door. And the barmaid came rushing at me and flapped at me saying, shoo, 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 men only. And I thought, my God, they're still doing it. And so I went downstairs and complained, and he was the man at the desk was very sympathetic. But it's those gut feelings you feel that here's a society in the 21st century, and we're still doing things like that and still experiencing things like that. So I think there's a long way to go, but I don't think it can be put on hold until after any revolution. I think we just have to keep working hard and bring consciousness as much as possible and try and change the situation. And both Chris and Camilla, I like this. I like the eyes, the growth of brains, and egalitarianism. Those are all very interesting anthropological features that I think are great. Anyway, thank you very much. I don't really have a question except to say I hope we can all carry on and just take into account everybody, not just okay, thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine. Liz, Shirley, you are up next, please.
Hey, it's not actually Liz, it's her daughter.
Sorry, Isabella.
Hi, it's all right, no worries. Chris, it's really more like a question that I became curious about while listening to Chris speaking about how the old women, the grandmas in the villages, in the hunter-gatherer communities would mock men for certain behaviours and things. And I was curious then, looking at our own culture at the moment, in terms of like men self-identifying as women and how that might be conceived through the eyes of these hunter-gatherer communities and these older women, since it seems that in these hunter-gatherer communities, from what I can understand, it seems really clear that women can make children and menstruate and men can't, and that's how to define men and women. So I imagined that there would be a response from these like grandmas, or if a man started self-identifying as a woman. So I was curious of what Chris might have to say about that. And then on another kind of offshoot from that thought process, it makes it, I'm a bit scared to say it because it can be such a contentious issue, but like the thing about men then trying to then like imitate women by cutting themselves so that they bleed and stuff like that out of fear of women's power and stuff. I'm curious then to imagine if that is in any part occurring today, since although I totally honor that a lot of trans women have genuinely like are women in a way in their psyche, that I have had suspicions myself that there could be some kind of unkempt psychological issues, challenges, or that might be occurring too, because there is also quite a lot of aggression in the trans movement towards women, and so I was wondering if there's any other, if Chris might have had any thoughts about this in relation to the hunter-gatherer mythos with men cutting themselves to try and be like women, if there's any parallels to what is happening today, and if so, is there anything that we can learn from these hunter-gatherer perspectives on gender and how to deal with it. Yeah, that was my question.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Next to speak is Jack Corrin.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks, Chris. Yeah, just I know this is going off the subject, but Mike raised it on the question of the lockdown, that if you don't go along with the lockdown, that's a way of avoiding domestic violence. It does strike me, I mean, as asked about face, Mike, of course there are negative consequences, but I don't think that calling for no lockdown is the right communist response. I mean, at least through my door, and I didn't do anything about it, but I mean, I know throughout many different areas, people were responding through collective action, i.e. we'll do your shopping for you, we'll organize together. And that sort of response, I think, is, much more socialistic, communistic, as opposed to here we all are in our own little units, and we're beating the shit out of each other, sort of type idea. So I'm very skeptical about taking that approach. Yeah, also in terms of what Peter raised, it reminded me, Chris, of, and I think there's a truth there, of David Graeber talking about the family. And I've got a lot of criticisms of him, and I know you have, but his version of the family is what we have left of communism at the present time, i.e. when you have children, you don't, total up their debts to you. pounds, shillings and pence, this is what you owe me. Of course, there are moral obligations, and in traditional societies, kids would look after their parents. Nowadays, there's care homes, but that's a different subject. But the point would be that I do think that what, Chris, but also historians actually should teach us is to think outside the box of the present in a really radical way. If you look back to the Communist Manifesto, 1847, 1848, Marx and Engels talk about the community of women of the future. I presume that what they're talking about isn't just the relationships between women and men, but the sexes themselves, how you raise children. That would also be related to production. In other words, if we look at the nuclear family, I don't think we should view it as this is somehow natural to us, that what we have now has always been. There was this thing called primitive communism, original communism, but in the future we'll have the nuclear family, but it will be nice because we can go around taking what we want. I rather like Chris's one, but of course it's up to the future to decide this. But I think the key question is that no matter how horrible the real revolution was, Chris, the fact of the matter is that you're emphasizing the role of ritual, culture, and fun. And precisely the point would be that if women asserting themselves over men and vice versa is fun, what's the problem? So I don't think it's a question of, hey, we've got this problem in terms of men and women. That's a problem to be eliminated. It's also something surely to be, there you are, to be celebrated. And just lastly, in terms of what you were raising, I mean, Chris will obviously answer for himself, and I'm not going to comment on transgender people and all the rest of it. I'd merely make the point that in terms of some of these ceremonies that the women go in for, that Chris has described, often they've got penises. They're pretending to be male. They are fluid. I don't know if that occurs the other way around, but women certainly in these societies have fun in terms of being transgender. Anyway, that was all.
Thank you very much. Next to speak is Anne, and I have 3 or 4 more speakers. We're about 35 minutes left, so it's getting a little bit tight. So I do urge comrades, if you do want to speak, let me know. I'll bring in Anne first, though.
Okay, just I wanted to respond to Mike on the issue of domestic violence, because I think the question that I was trying to point to was the fact that the lockdown has led to the re-emergence of existing problems, the articulation of the imbalance in power relations between men and women within the home. And in a situation where the woman was not able to go to work or was not able to drop the children off at the childminder, she was stuck there with him. He was then, usually it being him, able to take his anger and his frustration at his situation out on her because she just didn't have the power to resist. So that's the problem that I'm pointed to. From, I think, my experience of representing both men and women in the criminal process, or not the court process, in Ireland, women have to go and apply for court orders. In Britain, the police get more involved. On both of those, actually, there is neither of them are empowering. I think that we have to take a collective approach, which means refuges but proper accommodation, i.e. not like the situation where we have with refuges at the moment, where, you know, everybody's sleeping on top of each other. There are no proper facilities. It needs to be somewhere you can go to have a break, or where he should be told he gets out. You know, obviously that would be the ideal, where the woman and the children don't have to move. And I think it's important to stress the necessity for economic independence, i.e. I can afford to go and leave you. Therefore, you know, that creates a completely different, it's the dependency, the economic dependency, I think is a core problem within domestic violence, because I think that it leads to all sorts of other, you know, power imbalances. So I think that the freedom, the ability to leave is an empowering one, and the ability to know that you also have a group of people in your area who are going to come and defend you and help you to get out of the situation or kick him out. I actually listened to a very good interview with an Irish woman living in Australia for many years who had organised in her neighbourhood, basically what she used to do, because she was a bit of a brutal woman, she would just go to the men and she just tell them to get out. And, you know, they did either get out or, you know, or quieten down. There was like a way of being able to challenge it collectively. And I think that that must be the key to it, rather than making it seem like it's something that, oh, I don't know, where women are just the victims. I think it's a case of becoming empowered. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And the next speaker will be Philip. Philip via Gabby, I think, but I might be wrong. Philip. Phil. Oh no, he's here. I'll try and unmute you, Phil. Philip. Philip R. Okay. Phil doesn't seem to be here. Then I'll move on to our next speaker and come back to Phil. Next one is Ben Kozin. Ben, you're up next.
Ben Cousin.
Cousin. My apologies.
Can I be heard now?
Yes.
You are hearing me. Good. My anthropology and paleoanthropology is incredibly spotty, but I make no apology in view of Chris's very strong emphasis on menstruation for recycling a chat point I made deriving from Elaine Morgan, whom I'm a very, very great aficionado, a very ignorant aficionado of her aquatic ape theory, which I trust comrades here have some idea about. It is that the peculiar characteristics of Homo sapiens distinguish us from all other primates. Practically no hair, enormous amount of subcutaneous fat, the descended larynx. I won't go on forever on this. Originate from a basically seaside period of at least hundreds of thousands of years, by the Sea of Afar as it existed in northeast Africa. Chris will correct me, I'm sure, in all my errors on this thing. But the point I want to make that bears on his emphasis on menstruation is that I gather from Elaine Morgan that the menopause is actually unique to Homo sapiens, and it does seem to me that this points us towards an interesting discussion of evolution. And jumping on quite a long time, I did pick up from Chris's very, very interesting talk a lot of fascinating stuff about myths of origins of patriarchy, but I got very, very little indeed about the origin of patriarchy itself. How did at least some men, and patriarchy is surely not about the domination by the entire male sex, even the entire adult male sex, of the female sex. It is about the domination, like the that of the male elephant, seal, and so on and so on, the harem master over not only females, but also quite a lot of males. Be most grateful if Chris could comment on those queries. Thank you very much.
Then I need to come in, I think, because I can't
Yeah.
keep everyone in my memory otherwise.
That's fine. I'll give you another 5 or so minutes and longer. Well, take as much time as you need, because we've got another 30 minutes, but I want to give you a decent time to sum up at the end as well.
Okay, right.
All right.
Well, some very lovely points, and I won't reply to points which I just totally agree with. I mean, Anne's points I always agree with. Geraldine made some lovely points which I agree with. Isabella is the one who's made points which I'm not saying I disagree with, but they're just, they need addressing. So Isabella was asking about male menstruation and whether the people that I was talking about, the Bayaka, the women who laugh with their muaja, the older ladies who laugh at people, whether they would laugh at a man who self-identifies as a woman. Okay, I mean, there are two rather separate things. First of all, when men across the whole of Aboriginal Australia, but also very many, I mean, wherever men have a monopoly of over ritual power, in all these hunter-gatherer, complex hunter-gatherer and early horticultural societies, wherever men monopolize ritual power and say women once had it, they menstruate. So men menstruate in there, they cut their penises, they cut their ears, they bleed from the nose, whatever it is they do. And what they say is, while they're doing this menstruation, and also they do a kind of childbirth, they take boys from the women and put them in a huge big womb, and there's an experience of rebirth, and then the boys are given back to the women, having been born by the men. Whenever men do this, they say we are stealing women's power. We're doing things which women originally did. I mean, they say, using blood to assert power, getting involved in this bleeding once a month with the moon is a woman's activity which we've stolen from them, and we don't like it when women do it now. Now, that's a rather different thing, male menstruation in that context, from the kind of gender ambivalence, which is just a normal feature of hunter-gatherer life. So let me just say quite briefly, and actually John mentioned this as well, Jack mentioned this as well. When women do Ngoku, now this is a women's ritual when the women rule for a period in this particular so-called pygmy group in the Congo. When women do Ngoku, one of the things, it's a kind of sex education for girls. The girls are playing around, being boys, being girls, with these little sticks which they treat as penises, and it's a huge hoot. It's a raucous laugh, but it's also kind of sex education because the girls are kind of like the older ladies are sort of saying, this is what boys can get up to. Be careful, know how to handle boys, and they go through a sort of experimental actions in which they become male. But what Camilla's done, in particular Camilla, she's written several things in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute and other places, is describe the origins of gender. And she was touching on it the other day when she was saying gender is play. So gender is not the same thing as sex. And in fact, she was pointing out that across Africa, when boys get initiated, they are treated as girls. It's extraordinary. You'd think, wouldn't you, that if you're initiating boys into adulthood and girls into becoming women, it would be like boys are blue and girls are pink. You'd think that something like boys' initiation would initiate them into being a man, and girls' initiation is something about initiating them into being a woman. The paradox is it's exactly the other way around. A boy doing his initiation, and they're usually rather minor events compared with the girl's initiation, as Camilla was explaining, the boy is treated as a menstruating girl. So he turns into a girl in order to become a man. It's really very paradoxical. And the girl, in her initiation, she becomes a hunter. She's treated as a hunter. When James Wood, I remember James Woodburn telling me, he was saying, Chris, you're so right. And he gave the Hadzani term. When a girl first menstruates, everyone joyfully celebrates and they shout out, you've shot your first zebra. When she bleeds, she's shot her first zebra. So what I'm saying here is that we have this strange paradox of gender being almost like not only just not the same thing as sex, but it actually reverses sex. And the way we explain it in RAG is ever so simple, is if you want to establish sex strike, if a bunch of women want to signal, right, we're the wrong partners for you, the way to do it is to reverse the normal biological signals indicating yes to sex. So if you take an animal, a male animal or a male moth, for example, seeking a female, in the case of a moth, he will pick up a pheromone. And he's interested in that pheromone, what it says to him, and it's got to be the opposite sex to him. He was interested in a female, the same species. He doesn't want to have sex with some other species. It's got to be the same species of what he is, and in her fertile period. So right sex, right species, right time is the message. Ever so simple. Imagine a group of females wanting to reverse their availability, wanting to signal, no, we're on strike. Just reverse it. Instead of right sex, right species, right time, wrong sex, wrong species, wrong time. So switch your sex from female to male, switch your species from a human to an animal, and switch your time from ovulating to menstruation, and you've got it. And just to cut a long story short, the thing about this communism in motion is that we are free of the imprisonment into sex role stereotypes. It's almost as if, as the moon goes through its phases and the moon switches from male to female, from masculine to feminine, humans following the moon can switch from one gender to the other. So however much, even in the West, when people feel, okay, I don't really feel happy being straight, and then people have to sort of come out and be gay. I'd say have to, because obviously you have to, it's your identity. You just know that you're not comfortable being straight, so you become as gay. Or you can be a woman not comfortable with being female, and so you come out as a different gender, and a man, of course. But the point is that under this system, where we don't have communism in motion, we don't have all this, what Jack was calling fun, playing around with sexual difference. The point is that even if you come out as gay, the problem is, I think, is that you're sort of stuck there. You've got to be just consistently, fixedly gay, or fixedly, consistently trans, or whatever it is. And of course, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. People don't have much choice under capitalism, but it's the fixity I'm talking about. Because under the kind of communism in motion, ruled by the moon I'm talking about, you can be gay one moment and straight the next. You can be masculine one moment and then trans the next. I mean, you're everything, as Jack was saying, there's a fluidity there, where you go through these different potentialities, which all of us have. All humans have these different sexual and gender potentialities. Why be constrained into just fixing into one of those boxes? There's no need for it. Okay, lockdown, I mean, just very, very briefly on this. I mean, the lockdown is a marvelous, horrible, but horrible illustration of all that's wrong with capitalism, because when you're locked into being in this bloody thing called the nuclear family, this horrible little box, privatized box, then the real horrors of this situation for a woman come out, or in some places, of course, for a man, because that can happen too, but overwhelmingly, it's the woman who's being abused, and she's imprisoned in this little box. It's shocking and horrible. But of course, the box is there for reasons of long-term development of bourgeois economics and the bourgeois nuclear family. It's just that under lockdown, you're completely stuck there. But I do agree with Jack. I do agree that just very briefly, in Wuhan now, I don't know if anyone's looked at the sort of pictures of what's happening in Wuhan. Everyone's flocking into the swimming pools. Everyone's congregating in parks. Everyone's hugging and kissing. They've managed through a very severe lockdown to completely kill the virus in that area. To me, the problem with Boris Johnson and all these Brexit stupid people that are good at slogans like "Get Brexit Done" and all that stuff is that they're complete bungling idiots who delayed lockdown in order to keep profit going, and now of course they're trying to get the economy going when actually there's a slight rise in infections and all this stuff. So a very strong lockdown would have needed in order to get rid of the bloody virus, so we can have come out the other end. But I do agree with Jack that the crucial thing which has happened is it's shown us the communism. I mean, my experience, all my friends' experiences, especially when you're getting on a bit like I am, the number of people that have been around offering to do my shopping and do all the different jobs for me is really, really moving. And of course, for no material reward whatsoever. And that is the kind of communism, the instinctive communism, if you like, which David Graeber talks about. I won't go into Graeber's theories, but he's right. That there's a kind of instinctive communism which actually makes humans feel happiest. You feel happy and rewarded when you've done something for somebody else and been appreciated in doing that for no material reward whatsoever. Now, just finally, Ben's point about Elaine Morgan. Ben, I've written a book a long time ago. It's called Blood Relations. Here we are. There's a whole chapter of the shores of Eden. There's now geneticists. It's absolutely brilliant. They've found out where Homo sapiens actually did emerge in Africa. It's in a huge salt lake, which used to be Africa's largest lake. It's in what's now an extremely arid part of Botswana. But it was a massive area of lakes, rivers, shores, trees. It wasn't seaside, but it was like a mixed waterside economy. And there's absolutely even the people like Richard Wrangham, really severe patriarchs. Everyone now agrees, at least on the one crucial point of Elaine Morgan's theory about bipedalism. What got early hominins walking on two legs was wading in at least waist-high water, looking for bulbs and fish and shellfish and stuff. So wading, actually, Elaine Morgan pointed this out, wading in water meant you couldn't be walking on all fours, otherwise your head would be under the water and you'd drown. So, and there are many other aspects of the aquatic ape theory which are now being vindicated, although it's so strange to see these mainstream paleoanthropologists. They're kind of admitting that Elaine Morgan got it right, but they don't say so. It's a bit like what Geraldine was saying about when a woman says something, it can't be true, everyone laughs. And then the men says exactly the same thing, and they're, oh, a very profound point. People are making very profound points about water and human origins, and it's very, very profound. But when Elaine Morgan said it, apparently it was all absolutely ridiculous and absurd. But as I say, I've always defended a version of the aquatic ape. We never were dolphins. We didn't evolve in the sea. The Danakil Island thing may or may not be all that relevant, but we were mixed. We are the place where early hominids evolved was an ecology known as mixed waterside. The bends of rivers, marshes, wetlands, lake shores. That's the environment. Very, very rich in all kinds of food and animals, of course, because animals come to drink. So that was the kind of environment in which we evolved. A version, if you like, of the aquatic ape, but it's better to call it a riverside ape or a waterside ape than the aquatic ape.
Thank you, Chris. 18 minutes left. I have two more speakers to contribute. Just firstly, before I bring them in, an appeal to the hosts of this meeting. It's not in my power to make Gabby Rubin a panelist. So if somebody could do that, then Phil might be able to get in. Otherwise, he's out. So please, could somebody make Gabby Rubin that's happened. Thank you very much. In that sense, I will, given that, I'll hand over to Gabby/Phil.
Yes.
You have the word.
A very simple point I want to make. It goes back to Peter saying, can we transcend gender? Well, the whole thing about what we're discussing is that communism has to be the relationship between men and women. It's a sociological thing, an anthropological thing. It's not so much a mechanical thing. Like if you're talking to the average socialist, what we have to do is produce the right amount of things in the right amount of time for the right amount of people. It's rather mechanistic. And I think this tries to get us away from that view of things as to where we have to start. That's my bit.
Thank you, Phil. Good point. Well worth unmuting you for. Next is Jim Cook.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for a fascinating introduction and discussion, the whole thing. So I'm just chipping in at the end and hopefully saying something useful. When you replied to Peter about we enjoyed that revolution, let's have another one sort of thing, I would guess that would happen. That would have to happen in every sphere, not just in gender. I mean, if you were in a factory, if such a thing would be looked upon in that way in a communist society, and you've got somebody who manages or organises and does a very good job, like say Ben or Chris, and you come up to the annual election, you say, oh well, let's re-elect Ben or Chris. They did a good job, and so they might be there for a little while. And somebody new might come in and say, I don't think much of this idea. And you might get an element of, do you know who I am, sort of thing, creeping in, with support from fellow workers. And yeah, you might have to have a revolution all over again. And that might be a continuous thing for the rest of human existence. That's one point. The other very brief point, because you were talking about laughter early on, and of course, an exemplar of, I suppose, what you were saying is the current president of the United States. Has he ever been able to take a joke against himself? Thank you.
Okay, comrades, that is it, unless anybody would like to jump in. Otherwise, I'll let Chris sum up. Just one thing I wanted to say, Chris, in the absence of further speakers. While you were talking, I looked up correspondence that we had from 2012, and it relates to something that Anne said about the typical kind of, oh, sorry, is it, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, okay, so it's just people are pointing to my microphone. It relates to something Anne said. Anne said, well, you've got the kind of classic text, Engels, Babel, and then you had people like Zetkin, etc. One of the things that strikes me, and this is my bad as much as anyone else's, it's while I'm not claiming that the Second International was kind of a hotbed of anthropology, there is actually a lot more than meets the eye. And there are two examples. I went through our email correspondence from 2012, Chris. So again, this is really on me for messing this one up. I was meant to go away and translate Heinrich Kuno, who was a leading Marxist who actually became very right-wing as a result of the war. He's part of the Die Glocke group. But he was a Marxist intellectual who wrote a critique of Engels' origins, actually, which is still out there in German Fraktur. So if there are any volunteers for that, I obviously haven't got around to doing it. But that would be useful, I think, because I think even speaking to Jerome Lewis and Chris, they haven't actually been able to read that because it's still in German. And also Rosa Luxemburg, just to ask you about, Chris, you spoke about this a while ago, but in her collected writings now, expanded collected writings, there is a lot of anthropological material. And just thought maybe you could, if you had any thoughts on that and what you've encountered. So I'm not saying that, that there's this kind of big lost history, but there is material there after Marx and Engels, which, may be worth digging up. Thank you, comrades. I'll hand back to Chris now for a few minutes and to sum up.
Well, I'll start with Ben's point. Yes, Rosa Luxemburg wrote some magnificent stuff, actually, which has only just been translated into English, as Ben said. And it really is worth reading because she was able to use material which Engels, of course, wasn't, because Engels was writing a little bit earlier, 20 years or 30 years earlier. And Rosa Luxemburg goes to the material coming out at the time in the 1890s and 1900s from Aboriginal Australia. And I must say, I mean, Rosa Luxemburg really did get it. I mean, she just got the absolutely crucial importance of the lessons that communism isn't something new. I mean, she just understood it. She just, if communism is an unprecedented kind of, sort of thing which somebody's dreamt out of their, sucked out of their thumb, maybe Karl Marx had an idea, what about communism? But it never happened before. It would be a lot less persuasive than knowing that communism is the state of the human species for nearly all of our existence. And that class society and capitalism are a relatively recent aberration, which even though is now, dominant over the planet, still goes against the grain. We still feel, stressed with being dominated, being abused, being exploited. It causes us anxiety, and anxiety is a huge cause of illness. And and laughter is the best medicine, but it's very hard to laugh when you're out of, you're out of your home, you're out of a job, you're being harassed by the landlord. And Rosa Luxemburg really got those points that the future communism would be not a new invention. It would be a return to home, if you like, to something we all feel happy with. We all feel by nature that our own instincts and have actually evolved under a kind of communism which will be returned on a high level, of course, when the revolution is successful across the planet. I always like what Jim says about and I was present the other day when Camilla was giving a talk and Jim came in with this point about again, it's the same point that David Graeber makes very well, actually, and I would absolutely echo, which is that we just feel happiest when we're not under stress, and we just somehow, even under capitalism, we seek out venues, arenas, places, often the pub, of course, for so many of us, where you can just relax and have a laugh together. And then all the real complexities of discussion and conversation, and humor and laughter and really finding out about who your friends really are, come out when you've all had a good laugh and maybe had a few pints. But just to say, I haven't said enough about laughter because actually, when we think about communism, the important thing is as follows, and this is, again, it's not. I'm not saying this now that it's come out as some sort of invented sort of theory or something. Every hunter-gatherer ethnographer will tell you, what is the main leveling device? What is it that maintains equality? What is it that levels down people that try to get above themselves? It's laughter. It's humor. No man, for example, can come back with an animal and start boasting about what a mighty hunter he is. And what invariably happens in the Kalahari is that when a man's hunted an animal and he comes back, he has to go out of his way to say, well, I think I might have caught something. It's a bit skinny. It's hardly worth bothering about, because if he says I've caught a huge big zebra, he would just be laughed at. And of course, what happens is he says, oh, it's not worth worrying about. And then again, it's a wonderful, lovely, zebra with all those stripes. But he has to laugh at his own expense. And this constant leveling of function of laughter is what keeps the whole situation, communist. So what I wanted to say, that just like everything else which happens in the revolution, laughter itself is revolutionary. So what I mean by that is that laughter comes out of its opposite. So it's just like when Karl Marx was saying you need to get to capitalism to get out the other side. Without capitalism, you can't get to communism. You can't get to laughter without something very different from laughter. And I'll tell you what it is. It's what all monkeys and apes do, not just monkeys and apes. It's called mobbing. So say with chimpanzees, when an alpha male is being really unpleasant, rampaging around the place, chasing after people, trying to look after his, keep his hold of his harem, what can happen is that a bunch of females, especially if one of the females has been sort of beaten up or raped or something, or threatened, or more likely to be threatened to be abused or raped. And by the way, rape happens with chimpanzees. What happens is that the females, and this has nothing to do with laughter, they'll do what's called wah barking. They're starting to bark a particularly harsh, almost synchronized barking sound. And the kind of colloquial term for it is mobbing. They mob the females, and some males, the subordinate males, will mob that alpha male, and it'll become like a rising crescendo of mobbing sounds, barking sounds, which are like threatening to become action against that alpha male. And if there's enough of these females doing it, the alpha will get the message. Because in order to actually not be attacked, he'll have to sort of back down and stop chasing after whoever he was chasing after. Now, so mobbing, and by the way, mobbing is something which chimpanzees will do when they see a snake, for example. I think snakes' hearing is very different from the hearing of other animals. Complicated zoology, but it doesn't matter. The chimpanzees will mob any threat to themselves collectively. Now mobbing is a rhythmic vocalization. And what happens, and this is, again, it's kind of, there are some disputes about exactly where laughter comes from, but this is a sort of a very mainstream theory. What is laughter? Laughter is mobbing. It's aggressive, laughing at something, aggressively attacking something, but it's aggressive mobbing under reversed social conditions. So imagine an alpha male chimpanzee threatening everybody, being mobbed with these wah barks, and now suddenly he backs down. And now just imagine the mobbing, the aggressive synchronous chorusing of barks, rhythmic and contagious, continuing when the threat has suddenly dissolved. That's laughter. Laughter is when we've confronted some paradox, some threat, some fear, and the fear has suddenly dissolved, and the anxiety it dissolves along with it. But we carry on with the sounds for their own sake, if you like. So laughter is mobbing in reverse. It's mobbing continued once the anxiety has gone. And as soon as you think about laughter, you realize that it's got so many of the same characteristics as mobbing. It's contagious. It's usually at the expense of something or somebody, and the target of laughter is never a natural thing. You don't laugh at a cloud. You don't laugh at a funny shaped tree. You don't even laugh at an animal unless it's Tom and Jerry, unless it's been anthropomorphized. What you laugh at is a human who's got above his boots, and you laugh when he bumps back down to earth with a huge crash. The civil servant, Monty Python, whatever it is, walking along and he slips on a banana. Well, the reason you laugh is because it's not your mum. You don't care about him. It's funny because it's not you, if you like. But laughing has always got that edge of laughing at people, and certainly that's true of Majo, the kind of laughing I was talking about. It's almost mobbing, but the reason it's good humoured is because those women aren't afraid. They know that idiot, that arsehole, that misbehaving male, he's going to back down. He's going to join in with the if you like, mobbing, reverse mobbing, laughing at his own expense. And so what I'm trying to say really is that any revolution, it turns the world upside down. And the one bit of Jesus which I like, well, quite a few things which Jesus said which I quite like, is the last shall be first, the first shall be last. So in any revolution, it's the lowest of the working class, the lowest of the oppressed, who for a moment at least rise up. So it's the women, it's the casual workers, it's the non-unionized workers, maybe it can be the homeless. I mean, somehow a real revolution churns everything up from the very, very bottom, and the last shall be first and the first shall be last. I mean, just to end up, I imagine I've reached the end of my time now. The crucial thing is that this is the chief importance of the study of human origins. It counters that theory so widespread everywhere, really, when you think about it. If you dig deep down into people and say, well, you know, what is it? What is the problem with the idea of revolution? And it will always be at some level, well, you know, you can change this, you can change that, you can change the legislation, you can change the rules, you can adjust the financing, whatever it is, but no revolution will change human nature. There are certain things, the existence of war, the existence of poverty, sexism, these things, they're as much part of being human, part of the way things are, as having 4 fingers and a thumb on each hand. No revolution can change human nature. And the reason why the study of human origins is so important is because it shows us that everything distinctively human about human nature, even down to the shape of our eyes, the fact that we can laugh and enjoy a joke with each other, the fact that we can see ourselves as others can see us, the fact that we can agree on rules of behavior and up to a point even keep to those rules. A bit difficult when it comes to sex, but somehow we're brilliant at it compared with other animals. All these, and the fact, of course, that we can use language to share our dreams. These are things which, I mean, human nature is made up of different things. Part of our nature is chimpanzee, it comes from the apes, but there are certain aspects of human nature which are distinctively human. And these are actually products of the greatest revolution in history, the revolution which worked. We did it once. Knowing that, we can do it again.
Thank you very much, Chris. Excellent session. There was also a very lively text chat, which I will copy up and send over to you. And I may put it, to plug it again, under the comments for our YouTube channel, youtube.com/c/Communist Party of Great Britain. Do swing by there, give us a like, a subscribe, etc., etc. The next session will be at 4:30 with Mohsen Shamanesh on COVID-19 and pandemics. There is a link to register for that at communistuniversity.uk. If you haven't registered already, please do so. And on the, I suppose, on the topic of having a laugh at ourselves at our own expense, the comrades have set up a Discord channel for comrades to hang out with each other informally after the sessions. Particularly this evening, I think there'll be events going on. I will link that now for all panelists, discord.gg/DUEU3Q. Click there and register. It's very easy to do. An SO meal, yes, an SO meal on Discord, I think might be the plan, but there we go. Thank you very much, comrades. We'll see you in a couple of hours. Take care. Bye-bye.